Okay, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's Alaska webinar, which is titled Microplastics and Health, a Systematic Review of Recent Science. My name is Sarah. I'm the Communications Coordinator with Alaska Community Action on Toxics, or ACAT. Alaska is a program of ACAT and Collaborative for Health and Environment, and it's also part of CHE's broader international coalition of over 5,000 individuals across the globe. As usual for today's webinar, we will have some time at the end for audience Q&A. So please feel free to send in your questions using the Q&A box feature at the bottom of your screen. And you'll be able to send in your questions at any point throughout the webinar. So you can go ahead and send them in early if you would like. So I'll go ahead and jump right into introducing our speakers today. We have Abina Bakenra, who is a science associate working with the Science Policy and Engagement team at UCSF's program on reproductive health and the environment. And we have Dr. Nicholas Chartres, who is a senior research fellow at the University of Sydney, where he studies the commercial determinants of health, focusing on chemicals, nutrition, and public health. So thank you both for joining us today, and now I'll hand it over to you guys to get us started.
Thanks so much, Sarah, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, I guess, to everyone, depending on where you are. We really appreciate the opportunity to present some of our work today on the health effects of microplastics that Abina and I did over the last couple of years. I'm going to share my screen and we'll get started. And I'm confident I can do this because I just did 2 practice tests of it. So hopefully you're going to see my slides pop up. Up now. How does that look? All right, brilliant. As Sarah said, we have recently done a rapid systematic review. We're going to talk a bit about what that exactly is in a moment. Looking at the health effects of microplastics. This obviously is a nascent area of research. The last couple of years, it's certainly exploded. I know a lot of people are probably across some of the studies that have been coming up in the media over the last couple of years, looking at microplastics in different parts of the body. And so our aim of this work was to really synthesize that data, looking at specific health systems that we're going to show you. Importantly, Abina and I are presenting today, but we're doing this on behalf of our other co-authors, Courtney Cooper, Katie Pelch, Shafali Gandhi, and also Tracy Woodruff as well, who was the corresponding author and the director of the program on reproductive health and the environment. Importantly, we have no conflicts to disclose. As we present today, Abina and I are going to be going and sharing the slides and talking through our work. And as Sarah said, please feel free to pop questions in the chat. We'll address them at the end and hopefully have some time also to answer some questions in real time as well. So without further ado, I'm going to pass across to Abina to introduce the overarching problem. Thanks, Abina.
Yeah, thanks, Nick, and thanks, Sarah. So microplastics come from plastics, and as you can see here, plastic production has dramatically increased over the last 70 years. It's doubled since 2008 and is projected to triple in the next 30 years. So plastics are typically driven from fossil fuel companies. So fossil fuels like oils and gas from fracking are used to make plastics. And as fossil fuels for certain sectors like cars, building and heating or lighting is declining with increased electrification in response to climate change regulations, the fossil fuel industries and gas industries have been looking for new markets to continue to make money. So they've been building out their fracking and planning to make more plastics, which is concerning and driving this type of research. The largest sources of plastics are single-use and packaging plastics. This is followed by textiles and clothing, other sectors like tire wear, and then lastly, consumer products. As many of you know, there are significant environmental impacts in the plastics life cycle. Using consumer goods exposes people to toxic impacts of plastics, and these plastics include toxic additives contained in them. This can include phthalates, PFAS, flame retardants, bisphenols, volatile organic compounds such as formaldehyde, and of course, plastic particles, including macroplastics, microplastics, and nanoplastics. So what exactly are microplastics? Microplastics are small particles generally defined as less than 5 millimeters or 5,000 microns. And as you can see here, they're generally smaller than a pencil tip or the width of your hair or even a human blood cell. So they're definitely not visible to the human eye. So where do microplastics come from? They're either primary microplastics, which are intentionally manufactured as feedstock for plastics, production, cleaners, personal care products like microbeads in cosmetics and paints, or they can come from secondary microplastics, which are fragments degraded from larger products that contain plastics like food packaging, tires, and textiles. Like bulk plastics, microplastics can also be a variety of polymers with different physical and chemical properties. The concerning thing about these microplastics is that they're small enough to exist undetected in our food, air, and water. Microplastics will enter the environment, get into the food chain, into the water, and into the air, and therefore we're exposed through the food that we eat, the water that we drink, and the air that we breathe. They've also been discovered in remote and pristine locations, including the Antarctic and deep ocean trenches and the Arctic Sea. So their exposure is definitely ubiquitous. Due to their small size, microplastics also more easily enter and are distributed within the human body in comparison to larger particles. So, a recent study estimated that we consume a credit card's worth of microplastics each week.
Yeah, and I should just say we've had some interesting dialogue around this study that we cited in our review. It was actually conducted at the University of Newcastle in Australia, and so there's been some recent studies that have shown that this estimate is potentially an overestimate. I guess one of the big takeaways, and you'll see in the next couple of slides with this, is that the total amount we're consuming each day or we're being exposed to each day or each week isn't necessarily relevant, because what one of the key characteristics of these is that they bioaccumulate in our body. So regardless of the total amount we're getting exposed to each week or each day, the fact that once they're in our body and that we're finding that they're starting to accumulate is probably the most primary concern. So again, if anyone has any comment about this study being an overestimate, we certainly have seen that critique on it, but as I said, it's the fact that they continue to accumulate in our tissue, which is of a real concern. Thanks, Amanda.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, they do bioaccumulate and they migrate throughout the body after they bioaccumulate. So we've actually found, and different research studies have found this, that in almost every tissue and fluid measured, we have found microplastics. So this includes tissues and fluids like breast milk, placenta, in your stool, in the blood and in the lungs, in your brain, and in your testicles. So due to this ubiquitous exposure and the bioaccumulative characteristics of microplastics, the extent of human health impacts due to microplastic exposure is really of great concern. And actually, a recent study in deceased patients diagnosed with dementia found that those patients had 3 to 5 times more microplastic in their brains than in normal brains. And the study had also noted that there was notable deposition in the cerebrovascular walls, and they found that microplastics were accumulating and increasing over time. So as Nick mentioned, this is really concerning. There's also a growing body of evidence indicating other adverse health effects of microplastics. So this can include biological changes like oxidative stress and inflammation in human cell lines, poor cardiovascular and respiratory outcomes, metabolic disorders, gastrointestinal effects, reproductive effects, and really scarily, cancer in humans. So what we found was that current evaluations of the human health effects of microplastics to date have been narrative and non-systematic reviews, which failed to evaluate the quality and the strength of the evidence using rigorous, predefined, and transparent methods that minimize bias and provide a bottom line summary. So I'll hand it over to Nick to discuss what we did to kind of resolve the bias and the lack of systematic and transparent methods.
Yeah, thanks, Abina. So importantly, we did this work initially as part of a consortium known as CalSpec. It's called the California State Policy Evidence Consortium. You can see the logo up there on the right. Essentially, CalSpec was engaged by the California State Legislature to go and address policy questions that were of concern. And the first question that they actually addressed under this new program of work was, what are the main exposure pathways and sources of microplastics? What are the health effects, which is where we came in? And also, what are some of the policy options that are out there? And as part of that work, we did an initial scoping of the literature to understand, what's been done on this as a topic. And this was done back in 2022, we started this work. And what we found in our scoping was that, as Abina mentioned, that there were a lot of primary studies on different health effects in different parts of the body. And there were some reviews that were conducted out there, but they weren't systematic in the way that we conduct our research. Just as a bit of background, the UCSF program of Reproductive Health and the Environment developed a systematic review method. And for those who don't know what that is, I'm going to show you in a slide exactly what that is. About 10 years ago, these methods are used to essentially evaluate a body of evidence. So when I say a body of evidence, I mean a group of primary studies that are looking at a specific question. And this method allows you to bring all those studies together, evaluate them in a really rigorous way, a transparent way, and allows you then to come up with an overall summary of the evidence. My slides just stopped displaying there. And so that's what we did. And as you can see on the screen, our primary objective of this work, both with the California State Policy Evidence Consortium, but also the work we then did after that, was to evaluate the human and animal evidence of microplastics. We went and rated the quality and the strength of the evidence. We then tried to integrate those two different streams of evidence together. And then most importantly, we wanted to come up with a really clear, succinct bottom line statement regarding the health effects of microplastics for the health effects that we evaluated. So that's what we're going to look at today. We used what we call a rapid systematic review approach. I'm going to show you the steps of a systematic review in the next step. But essentially with the California Evidence Policy Consortium, we only had 6 months to do this first review, and we did it as a report. And I know Sarah's dropped the link in the chat to this report to you, and you can take a look at it. So we had 6 months. So what that meant was we had to modify the approach we take normally to doing a systematic review. A systematic review can sometimes take up to 1 to 2 years to do, based on the rigor that you apply to the evaluation process. So what we did, we adopted the methods of Cochrane. Some of you might not know who that is, but it's a group, it's a world-leading group that does systematic reviews in the clinical sciences. And they developed rapid systematic review methods during COVID-19. And they were using those methods to basically evaluate the evidence on things like quarantining and the use of masks. And they were coming up with evaluations of the evidence in a matter of weeks, as opposed to, like I said, 1 to 2 years. So we adopted those methods and we applied them to this approach. This is the steps of a systematic review. And so we went through each one of these in detail. And today, our presentation is essentially framed around this process, so you can understand what we did to get to the answers and to the conclusions that I'm going to share with you today. And the reason why that is important is that you'll be able to see that you'll be able to see the decision making that we took at every step of the process. You can see every study that we included into our review. You can see how we handled those studies. So did we include the studies into the review? Why did we exclude them? And that's critical, because when we get divergent answers to questions like microplastics, what are the health effects? And sometimes you might see, in one review, they come up with one answer, and another review, they have another answer. And you're sort of like, how do you have essentially the same question, but two different answers? This methodology allows you to understand how you'll arrive at that answer. And so the red arrows that you can see on the screen are the steps of the systematic review process that we took and modified to make it rapid. And so for the scoping process, instead of going and spending a few weeks up front trying to understand what all the evidence said to narrow our question. Because we had a short timeline, we basically ran our searches really quickly, but we did a very broad search and then narrowed our our included outcomes. When we screened our studies into a review, it's normally really important that you have two people doing that in tandem. We had one person doing it, but another person quality checking them. The same for data extraction. And then for risk of bias, if you're not familiar with what that is, you're essentially looking at each study and looking at their strengths and limitations to understand how much you can rely on them for the answer. We also had one person essentially doing that step and a second person quality checking. The rest of the review is exactly the same. So that's just how we modified it, just so you understand when you see the title Rapid Systematic Review, how that's different to a normal one. So I'm going to take you through those steps that you just saw here on this slide, through the methods, just so you can understand exactly what we did, and also so you can understand, I guess, what specific outcomes we were looking at. So importantly, the first thing we did, we went and developed what we call a protocol. And we did this back in 2022. We published it on OSF, which you can see there on the right-hand corner. And what a protocol is, it's essentially your predefined approach in really fine detail of how you're going to go about evaluating this question. And so you can see it's 50 pages. I don't know if we gave you the link to this, but we can certainly send it to you. And it outlines everything we're going to do. And it essentially looks like a study. So it has the methods, it has an introduction, it has all this detail, but what it doesn't have, obviously, is the results. And the reason why it's important to do this is it allows the end user, so be it a regulator, be it yourself, a community that might have an interest in this topic, to see what we said we were going to go and do. And then at the end, obviously reading our study, to see whether we actually went and adhered to every step. So did we conduct the search how we said we we're going to conduct it? Did we look at the outcomes we said we we're going to look at? Did we do the analysis how we said we're going to do the analysis? And what that does, it minimizes bias and it stops people from cherry picking the studies they want to include into review. And it also stops them from basically selecting the analysis or the results that may answer the question that they want to support their hypothesis. So it's all predefined, and we importantly put this out publicly for people to access early on. And we did make changes, and we made a number of changes, and we actually show that in the manuscript, how we deviated from this. So the first step after you do your protocol, or start building out your protocol, is you've got to ask a question, obviously, which our question was, what are the health effects of microplastics? But in order then to develop a framework for conducting the review, most people, when they're doing a systematic review, will develop what we call a PECO statement. And the P, E, C, and O stand for population and participant. The E stands for the exposure. So what's the exposure of interest? The C is what's the comparator? So if you have an exposed group, what's your comparator group that you're interested in? And then the outcome obviously is critical. What are the outcomes you're interested in looking at? So what I'll draw your attention to here is for the exposure, we were interested in any exposure to microplastics that occurred prior or concurrent to diagnosis or exacerbation of any health outcome. So we're very broad initially with the outcomes. And the exposures could come from any route, air, water, or food, any duration, and any exposure pathway. And we did that because we wanted to be very broad and ensure that we included as many studies as we could. Our comparator was essentially any human and animals are exposed to lower levels. And then our outcomes were any adverse health outcomes. And that was defined by the US EPA definition, which I'm going to show you in one slide. Importantly, we also defined what a microplastic was. And so we use this definition, a solid and polymeric material to which chemical additives or other substances have been added, which are particles that are less than, as Abina said, 5,000 microns in one dimension. Just so you understand what solid means, it's a substance or a mixture that does not meet the definition of a liquid or gas. And polymetric material means either a particle of any composition with a continuous polymer surface coating of any thickness, and a particle of any composition with a polymer content. And that's an important definition because we took it from the California Water Board definition and modified it to include all microplastics without a % content of polymers and lower dimension boundary requirement due to difficulty in measuring and potential exclusion of microplastics that come from surface coatings or tire wear. And both of those we wanted to include in our review. So our adverse outcome definition. We took the US EPA's definition, which is a biochemical change, a functional impairment, or a pathological lesion that affects the performance of the whole organism or reduces an organism's ability to respond to additional environmental challenge. And we also use the California law hazard trait regulation definition because we were doing this for the California state legislature, and it aligns with the US EPA's definition, which is an adverse effect. The toxicological hazard traits and endpoints means a biochemical change, functional impairment, or pathological lesion that negatively affects the performance of the whole organism or reduces an organism's ability to respond to an additional environmental challenge. Importantly, adverse health outcomes for us included two things. We were thinking about what we call apical endpoints. For those who don't know what that is, it's an observable endpoint. Things such as cancer or a birth defect or an organ level effect that you can see. But we're also really interested in biological responses that influence things like the DNA, things like oxidative stress, and Abina's going to talk a bit about that now. So there are our two main things that we're focused on, apical endpoints and these biological changes. I think I'm going to pass to you. Is that right, Abina?
Yeah, that's
Thanks.
right. Thanks, Nick. And so Nick mentioned that CalSpec had a really compressed timeline because they're dealing with regulators and they're trying to figure out the types of information that's out there on microplastics. So given that 6-month timeline, it doesn't make sense for us to summarize all of the information about any adverse health effect out there. So instead, and we noted this in our systematic review methods, we decided to prioritize specific systems. So we prioritize digestive, reproductive, and respiratory system outcomes. And it's important to state for transparency that we actually did not look at the study results before we made the decision to prioritize these outcomes. That was made before any of the results and data extraction did happen. So why did we decide to prioritize these specific systems? Well, first for digestive, because food and water are major routes of exposure to microplastics, it's important to consider that the digestive system is also a first point of entry for potential toxicity. And there's a range of outcomes that were associated with the digestive system, including inflammatory disease and cancer. For reproductive, we prioritize this because the reproductive system may be particularly sensitive to environmental insults. There was also a lot of policy interest for regulatory agents, including the Cal EPA, on reproductive toxicity outcomes. And then lastly, we prioritize respiratory because it accounts for the direct inhalation exposures. The respiratory system is also a first point of entry for potential toxicity, similar to the digestive system. And also we know from looking at the evidence that's out there that microplastic exposure is ubiquitous in the air. So as Nick mentioned, we did consider apical and biological changes. So we did organize our eligible outcomes by the apical outcomes and the biological changes. So for the organization of biological changes, we were guided by this concept of key characteristics. And so this is developed by people outside of our organization, but administrative organizations that are like IARC, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, have come up with key characteristics for carcinogens. And so key characteristics are biomarkers or mechanistic effects that comprise properties of known human carcinogens or reproductive toxicants. And so some examples of what these can include for carcinogens are electrophilicity, genotoxicity, alteration or DNA repair or genomic instability, the induction of epigenetic alterations, inducing oxidative stress, inducing chronic inflammation, being an immunosuppressive, modulating receptor-mediated effects, causing immortalization, and then lastly, altering cell proliferation, cell death, or nutrient supply. And so, as I mentioned, that there are key characteristics for both carcinogens and reproductive toxicants. So for digestive and respiratory outcomes, we utilize those for carcinogens, and for the reproductive health outcome, we utilize the key characteristics for reproductive toxicants.
Yeah, it's really important to note, thanks Sabina, is that we had a number of experts that previously worked at IARC, which is the International Agency for Research on Cancer, that were part of the development of these key characteristics. And these were developed over the last decade, and they're used by IARC to classify contaminants as carcinogens. So they helped us, the list that you can see here on the screen, they helped us identify what they thought were the most relevant to these systems. And that's how we basically organised our outcomes of interest. And so we worked with these two experts, we acknowledged them in our manuscript, because this is a really important emerging area of research where data like this, which is often described as mechanistic data, is being used more and more to identify emerging contaminants that we may not have human data on. Thanks, Vena.
Yeah, and we'll touch a little bit more about the use of animal studies for policy and decision making. But moving into our searching and screening strategy. So we performed a comprehensive search in partnership with a librarian at UC Davis. The first search was actually run back in July 2022, and we ran that in a number of databases. So those were PubMed, Embase, ProQuest, and the Web of Science. And then because we ended up doing more work past the CalSpec report, we actually did rerun those searches in April 2024, and that search was not restricted by year. So we included primary human observational studies, which included cohort, case control, cross-sectional, and other relevant epidemiology designs. And we included experimental animal studies, such as mammalian rodent studies. So that would be like rats and mice. So in order to meet our inclusion criteria, the studies had to meet, and these are not exhaustive, it's just the main points, but they needed to meet the following criteria. So we wanted them to have repeated exposure to microplastics, and that was important because we really wanted to look at the effects over time and to see if there was a dose-response relationship between the microplastic exposure and these different outcomes across the systems we were looking at. Exposure needed to occur via food or water for the digestive and the reproductive studies. And then for the respiratory studies, exposure needed to occur via the trachea or nasal passages.
All right, so we're going to take a look at our... Oh, no, sorry, this is the analysis still. Oh, sorry, I'm going to go back one slide. Because I thought there was a second slide talking about the analysis. The reason why this is important is that, and I don't actually have a slide for it, so I'm just going to describe it to you, is that typically when we do a systematic review looking at environmental exposures and health outcomes, we aim always to do what we call a meta-analysis, which is the quantitative combination of studies so we get an overall effect estimate of those studies. So if you think about, a question like microplastics and we're looking at, a reproductive outcome, if we're looking at something like sperm quality, we'd typically try to find all of those studies that were looking specifically at that question. If they were sufficiently homogeneous, which means that if the population, the animal or the human studies were similar in the population, the exposures were similar enough, and then the outcome was specific to sperm quality measured in a similar way, we would then combine all those study results. And the reason why we do that is that you get it's a more powerful, you get greater power, and you also get more precision. Unfortunately, with this review that we conducted, we were unable to do a meta-analysis based on the fact that these studies that we were looking at, and we're going to just talk about the results in a moment, were largely animal studies. We did have human studies, but it's certainly an emerging area that's coming up. But we were dealing mainly with animal studies that weren't reported very well. So we had animal studies that weren't providing specific effect estimates. We were trying to extract data from figures and tables that often weren't on the same scale. And essentially, we weren't able to use that data in a consistent way to meta-analyze our study. So what we had to do in the end was use an approach where we got guidance from Cochrane who I mentioned at the very start, they do a lot of work on how to do evidence synthesis when you can't do a meta-analysis or quantitative combination. And so we use some of their approaches, which I'm going to describe when I show you the results, to demonstrate visibly what the direction of the results are. And we use things like as Abina mentioned, the dose response of the study. So we basically looked at whether there was a consistent dose response. We had to rely on things like p-values, even though they don't give you important information like whether the change between the exposed and the control group is, biologically meaningful. And we also looked at things like the direction of the effect. And so we combined all that information together to then say, do we think there is, harms being caused by these microplastics on the specific outcome? So we're going to show you those results in a moment, but I just wanted to explain to you why we couldn't do a meta-analysis. And this is an important area to describe because this often happens in environmental health research. And often what happens is that people just do a narrative synthesis. So they basically write pages of text. And if you read that text, it's very difficult to ascertain exactly what the overall effect is, because they just describe one study doing this and one study doing that, and they talk about p-values. So we did, like I said, the best approach you can when you can't do a quantitative approach like a meta-analysis. I think I'm oh no, this is me again. The second really important part of that is once you've looked at the study results and you have identified, whether you think there is a health effect or not, a critical step then is to say, how much can we rely on this data? So we've included, as an example, 10 studies looking at, the effect of microplastics on something like sperm quality. We've seen there's an effect based on the study results, but can we rely on these studies? And what is the overall confidence we have in that? And so this step that I'm going to describe here is essentially how we arrived at our level of confidence. And it's based on the fact that we evaluated both the primary studies, but also we evaluated the overall body of evidence. So I'm going to draw your attention to the left-hand column first, where it says quality of the evidence. Essentially, when you have a body of evidence looking at a specific health outcome like sperm quality, you can evaluate that body of evidence using a range of factors, which is the middle box. And those factors look at things such as the risk of bias of the studies, and that's done at the primary study level. So it's looking at the strength and limitations of the study. So how many of those studies do you think are reliable? You then look at the indirectness of the study. So are the studies that you've included answering the question that you set out to? So is it in the population of interest? Is it looking at microplastics as you defined it? Is it looking at sperm quality as you defined it? Inconsistency. So do the study results all line up, or are they sort of going in different directions? The imprecision. So are they close and accurate? Are they large studies? Are they precise estimates? And then publication bias, like, is there concerns that you haven't found all of the studies that are out there on microplastics? Because critically, we're doing a systematic review. So we want to try to identify every study out there to ensure that we're confident that we're not missing anything. And so you go through each one of those and you consider them, and you can basically rate the confidence you have in that body of evidence up and down. You also have the ability to then rate the evidence up based on things like, is there like a really large effect estimate in these studies? Is there a consistent dose response, as Abina mentioned before? And also, is there this idea that there wouldn't be any potential residual confounding that you haven't accounted for? And once you consider all of that, you then come up with a rating. So again, thinking about sperm quality, if you have 10 studies that are looking at sperm quality, and you see this result that there is this effect on microplastics harming sperm quality, what's the overall rating for that based on those factors you just looked at? Is it high quality evidence? Like, are you, really confident in this evidence? Is it moderate quality? Are there some things like, risk of bias that you're concerned about that you might downgrade your confidence? And so you go through systematically for every outcome that you're looking at, which I'm going to show you, and you basically come up with this rating of the evidence overall. The second step, moving across that right column that you can see now, is the strength of the evidence. So you've looked at the quality, but then you think about these additional factors. So you think about the quality of evidence. Okay, I've got high quality evidence. I've got studies that are all in one direction showing harm. I've got confidence in these effect estimates because, they're in, a range of different studies that are looking at different rodent models. and that they're of reasonable study size. And so I'm pretty confident that these studies are a good reflection of what all of the evidence is, and that they're all showing similar effects. And then you come up with an overall conclusion of what you think the evidence is telling you. And you can see down the bottom there, we had 4 hazard identification conclusions. So essentially what your bottom line summary is. And these are based on the National Toxicology Program. Their Office of Health Assessment Translation have a system, which I'm about to show you. And they're the conclusion ratings that we could have: known to be a hazard to humans, presumed to be a hazard, suspected to be a hazard, or not classifiable. Now, I'm going to show you one other semi-complicated slide, but I'm going to take you through it slowly so you can understand how we arrived at our conclusions that we're going to show you in a moment. Essentially, you have 2 streams of evidence, like I mentioned, or as Abina mentioned, that were in our systematic review. We had human studies, which is down there on the y-axis, and then we had animal evidence, which is down there on the x-axis. And as you can see, depending on the level of human evidence on the y-axis, you can get different ratings. So if you have really good, high quality human evidence, you don't need any animal evidence. You basically can come up with a conclusion that it's known to be, a microplastics known to be a hazard to human health. And then as you go down the human evidence, depending on the quality, so if you have moderate, you might then need moderate evidence for animal evidence to have a presumed rating. And then if you go all the way down for the human evidence, and you can see that it says low or inadequate, if you have only human evidence, that would mean that you can't classify whether it's a hazard or not. But if you have no or low human evidence, but you have moderate quality animal evidence, or even high quality animal evidence, you can still come up with a suspected or a presumed rating for microplastics. And so we use this schematic to basically work out, based on the animal and the human evidence, what we thought the bottom line summary was. So is it a known hazard? Is it a presumed hazard? Is it a suspected hazard? And we did that for each outcome. And so you're going to see in a moment, we're going to show you the results of our outcomes. And then you're going to see we have this concluding statement that uses some of this nomenclature to basically describe what our overall conclusion is on the hazards of microplastics. Again, a little bit technical, but if you go and read our review and again reflect on this, it should become a little bit clearer. But again, this is really important because it allows you to understand how exactly we got to that bottom line summary of the evidence. All right, so I'm going to jump into the results. This is the important bit that everyone's interested in. And we've got about 5-6 minutes left, and then we'll open up for questions. So importantly, the takeaway on this slide is that we end up doing 2 searches. We ended up finding there was around 3,000 studies that were relevant to our review. But in the end, we included 31 studies, which you can see at the bottom there. 3 were human and 28 were animal studies. What was interesting was that the human studies were published between 2022 and 2024. So it's a nascent area of research. They were published in different parts around the world: Turkey, Iran, and China. And they were measuring microplastics in maternal amniotic fluid, the placenta, and also nasal lavage fluid. For the animal studies, which was the bulk of our research, they were published between 2018 and 2024. They were mainly conducted in China, and we had a large majority of mice, 22, which you can see the little picture there. Our rodents per study were around 15 to 180, and the length of the exposure typically was around 14 days to 32 weeks. The plastic type, majority overwhelmingly was polystyrene. But we also saw studies that tested polyethylene, polypropylene, and also tire wear particles. And you can see the size ranges over there between 0.1 and 467.85 microns. So these are the results. So for the digestive system, very high level. So we looked at lots of different endpoints. So I'm just going to draw your attention to the left-hand side here first. We concluded that microplastic exposure is suspected. So remember, our schematic is suspected to adversely impact immunosuppression based on high quality evidence, gross or microanatomic colon small intestine effects based on moderate quality evidence, cell proliferation and cell death, and chronic inflammation. So those 4 that you can see there are all those key characteristics. So those biological changes that Abina mentioned before. On the right-hand side, you can see that we actually couldn't classify some of our outcomes because of low quality evidence, including oxidative stress and also digestive hormones. So what's an example of what we did? I'm going to show you. So this is for the colon and small intestine, what we call the apical outcome. So changes essentially in the length of the colon and small intestine. This is how we had to present the data. So importantly, I'm going to draw your attention to the figure first up the top. You can see on the y-axis, essentially the size of the study. So there was up to 60 rodents in our studies. The next thing you can see, obviously, there are these bar graphs, all these bars, and these are different colors based on the statistical significance of the results. So the majority of the results that we saw were statistically significant, and the different colors and the different levels of statistical significance. So dark green shows that it's 0.001, and red means that it was greater than 0.05. But what's important, you can see the line underneath this bar graph is that every single result that we found looking at the changes in colon and small intestine length, all were in the direction of harm. So every single study result we found looking at this specific outcome were showing harm. So that's a critical piece of this of these results. The next thing is just finally the asterisks that you can see above the bars. That's essentially showing that the number of studies that showed a dose response. So in other words, as the exposure increased, some more microplastics in these animals, the greater the response. And so you can see overwhelmingly the studies in this for this outcome had dose response effects. And so we were really confident looking at this visually this data based on the statistical significance of the results, the direction of the effect, but also the dose response in terms of what we thought was the overall effect of microplastics on these colon and small intestine effects. This is how we summarized it. We did this statistical analysis. It's basically showing, it's called a proportion of effects estimate. It basically shows how many studies were showing that they were harmful versus those that weren't. As you saw, all 22 studies were showing that they were harmful out of the 22. And so we come up with this summary statistic just to explain that. And then this is our concluding statement. Using, again, that schematic that I showed you, we concluded that exposure to microplastics is suspected to adversely impact the colon and small intestine in humans based on the moderate quality evidence that we saw. So using those factors I showed you, the direction of the effect, they were all showing harm, and then the confidence in the association. There were lots of studies, and we thought the size of the studies were ample. And so we came up with this summary of suspected. For reproductive results, we concluded microplastics exposure is suspected to adversely impact sperm quality, female follicles, and reproductive hormones. And you can see based on the quality of evidence there as well, some was high and some was moderate. Again, just to give you a snapshot of an example of sperm quality, this is what it looked like. You can see, again, we had, I think, 9 results in this instance, and all 9 of the study results we found were all showing harm. Again, you can see they're all statistically significant in this example. And again, the majority of these results had a dose response, which gives us greater confidence in these results because we know that as microplastics increase, so do the health effects. Again, we did a summary statistic showing that all of the results were harmful. And we came up with our concluding statement, which is identical to the last one I showed, which is that they're suspected to adversely impact sperm quality. This time was based on higher quality evidence, not moderate. Again, the direction effect was overwhelmingly in the same direction, and the confidence in the association was based on the fact that, again, all these studies we thought were a sufficient size and, again, showing consistent effects. The last result before I pass to Albina to just go through the discussion are the respiratory results, and we concluded microplastics are suspected to adversely impact pulmonary function, lung injury, and then 2 key characteristics of chronic inflammation and oxidative stress. And again, you can see all these were based on moderate quality evidence. And this is what our chronic inflammation, so this is a key characteristic looked at, where you can see, I think there's 31 study results here. You can see on the left-hand side, there was 1 study result that showed no harm. The rest of them overwhelmingly were showing harm. Again, the majority of them with those little asterisks above were all showing a dose response, so that harm was increasing as the microplastic exposure increased as well. Again, we did our summary statistic. This time it wasn't 1 because there was 27 results out of 28 showing harm. But again, our overall summary was very similar to the other 2 because the evidence was similar, the direction of the effect was similar, and we had similar confidence in the association. So I'm going to pass to Alina for the discussion.
Great, thanks, Nick. I'll quickly go through this so we have some time for questions. But essentially, the findings that we've uncovered carry significant implications for both policy and research moving forward. We can address this plastic crisis through both individual and collective action. Um, and honestly, first, given the indication of harm that we identified in this systematic review, there's definitely a need for additional research on the health effects of microplastics, but that shouldn't preclude action on a global and national level. We strongly recommend that regulatory agencies and decision makers act on the limited evidence that has been shown here. And as evidence grows, it gets stronger and stronger. So there's many ways that they can act to prevent and mitigate human exposures to microplastics. One of these ways is through the US EPA's Toxic Substance Control Act. And to do this, you can consider microplastics under this idea of a class of chemicals. And under TSCA, the US EPA does its chemical risk evaluations. And so that's a really key component of identifying health risks and advocating for risk management actions. And so this idea of like the category of chemical substances or doing risk evaluations based on a class of substances, EPA defines that as a group of chemical substances a group of chemical substances where the members of which are similar in molecular structure, in physical, chemical, or biological properties, or in use, or in mode of entrance into the body or into the environment. And so microplastics can easily fit this definition and should be regulated as a class under the TSCA in the US EPA. There can also be a way for the EPA to conduct a cumulative risk assessment based on their draft approach, which they've already done to address microplastics as a class. And fourth, there's this kind of continued need to educate clinicians and the public about plastics and microplastics as a driver of disease. And the program on reproductive health is one of those places where we're continuing to do this. And we educate about other toxic chemicals, but there needs to be greater acceptance and understanding of how we can reduce these exposures. But critically, it's important to understand that this message shouldn't be that this falls on personal responsibility as the best way to reduce harms, but that this should be a systemic change happening on a global and national scale.
We won't go through this, but we had some strengths and outcomes. I mean, some strengths and limitations. We've talked a lot about what the strengths were, about how we used the key characteristics, and also the rigorous methods we used. The limitations are important. We'll talk about this in our discussion. I think the fact that we're looking at animal studies that are looking at very clean microplastic particles and only one exposure pathway at a time. So we actually think a lot of these studies are an underestimate of the true harm of microplastics based on that, and we can talk more about that now. And overall conclusion was that these are hazards potentially linked to colon cancer because we saw chronic inflammation in the colon based on the key characteristics. They reduce sperm quality, so they're a reproductive hazard, and we have concerns that they are potential potentially likely to cause lung cancer due to chronic inflammation also in the lung. But with that, I'm going to pass back to Sarah, and we can open up the floor to some questions. And I saw some questions dropping into the chat.
That was great. Thank you so much. We can get into the audience questions now. So if you haven't sent in your questions, now is the time to do that. I already see a few, and for our speakers, if you see one that you'd like to highlight, feel free to jump in.
Okay.
Yeah. So I see a question from Marina asking if some of these health effects could be due to endocrine disrupting chemicals in plastics. And that's definitely something that we want to emphasize, is that a lot of these plastics do contain chemicals that we already know are reproductive toxicants or are toxicants to other systems across the body. So a lot of the reproductive effects, and we acknowledged and saw in our results too, that there are hormone impacts of plastics, so that can be due to those endocrine disrupting chemicals present in the plastics.
The second one, I hope I pronounced your name properly, Milika. if it's omnipresent environment with all limitations in conducting quantification in tissues, how did you define comparator? Essentially any lower levels of exposure. So the 3 observational studies that we had were cross-sectional. They were essentially looking at people, that had a specific outcome of interest. And then they were looking at a population that didn't have that outcome, and they were just basically looking at the levels of particles and comparing them. So any study that was looking at different levels of exposure that had, lower levels of exposure in the comparator. In the animal studies, same thing. When we were interested in looking at a control group that didn't have any exposure, and then we wanted to look at different levels of exposure in the control group. So it had to have more than 2 groups within the study. So it couldn't just be an exposed in a control group. We wanted to see, different levels of exposure, across the animal studies as well. But in answer to your question, essentially lower levels or no level of microplastic compared to the highest exposed group was our inclusion criteria. I'll take the next one as well. Consideration given to the method of measuring and classifying the microplastic. So the animal studies, as I mentioned, they gave us the size. We didn't go into this in the talk. We gave a range. So they gave the particle size. They also talked about obviously the makeup of these microplastic particles. We actually did a sensitivity analysis, which I didn't go into. So in some of these animal studies for each outcome, they were using different particle types. So some were looking at polyethylene, some were looking at polystyrene. And one of the questions we got asked when we did the review from the reviewers was, is there a difference by particle type in the terms of the health effects? And so we went and did a sensitivity analysis for each outcome and said, is there a difference when you look at polystyrene versus polyethylene, for example, and the health outcome? We found no difference. I mean, there weren't a lot of other studies. The overwhelming majority was polystyrene. But when we did the sensitivity analysis, we found that the health effects were the same regardless of the particle type. Ted's got a question. Definition of microplastics. Specify chemical additives in addition to the polymer, but your study selection included some studies are pure. It was either or. So we wanted to ensure that you could have both types of microplastics in the review, because we knew that we were going to potentially get both. So it was basically an either or. You could have the addition to the polymer, but also you could have pure plastics in the animal studies. Milika, so we didn't do the integration. It's a really good question. So we talked about at the start that one of the pieces of the systematic review is to integrate human and animal studies together. That's dependent on having, and we're actually doing this now, Vina can probably talk to this as well. We're doing this now on a study looking at paraquat and also QACs. You need outcomes in the animal and human studies that are concordant for you to be able to integrate the evidence together. And so because we had so few human studies that were looking at very different outcomes compared to our animal studies, none of them were actually related. And so we couldn't merge the human and animal evidence to come up with a even stronger classification, which was a shame. What I would say to that is that we are looking to make this a living systematic review. What that means is essentially you rerun the searches and update the review every 3 months. Because this is certainly, whilst I said it's a nascent area of research, it's exploding. And so between the time we ran our first search in 2022 and our second search in 2024, we saw a proliferation of not only animal studies, but also human studies. So whilst we couldn't integrate the evidence, we think there is opportunity moving forward. I'll pass back to you, Albina, if you got any.
Yeah, definitely. I think the important part of that, and we mentioned before, systematic reviews need to be transparent and very rigorous in their methods. So that evidence integration step, in our current review, we're doing in the protocol development. So really making sure that we understand the types of endpoints that are out there and looking through and working through that concordance to see if that integration is even possible, and hoping that it'll strengthen the overall conclusion on the harm of the chemical.
Ted's got a question for you, actually, Abina, about the class and the TOSCA definition. One of the things you might have heard, Ted, is that it's not only about the physical and biological, but it's also can be based on the, is it point of entry or
Yeah,
what?
so it can be based on the point of entry as well. And since microplastics, they're most commonly the exposure route is via food or water and air. You can group under TSCA a class of chemicals based on that exposure route. So since many of the microplastics exposures happen in the exact same way, you can group based on that. You can also group based on the physical or chemical and biological properties. So there's different ways that you can take the microplastics and group them, whether it's the common effect that they're having or the common route of exposure, and still regulate it as a class.
Yeah, really important. Great question. Thanks, Ted. Cindy, there was polystyrene found in the rats. What was that from? I wonder, polystyrene clamshell. So it's a good question. These were all basically, every animal study had these pre-manufactured polystyrene particles that were pristine. They came from these labs. And that was one of our limitations that I quickly went over, is that these, they're not real life exposures. You don't get a clean polystyrene particle being entering your body. So we typically, as Abina said, these will have other adhesives, contaminants attached to them, and also these were spheres typically. Often the particles that enter our body will be jagged. A lot of these bioaccumulation studies are showing they're like jagged edges that could cause physical damage. So in answer to your question, Cindy, it was a clean polystyrene particle that was made in a lab. And that we think that's one of the limitations, that it's not really what we get exposed to.
Yeah. Thanks, Nick. There's another question asking about what individuals can do to avoid exposure. And obviously, we mentioned a lot of the systemic changes that can occur, but on an individual level, there are ways that you can reduce your exposure to microplastics. You can do that by trying not to drink or eat food in plastic containers or in plastic materials, making sure that you're not microwaving your foods in plastic containers where possible. And we understand that there's a lot of financial limitations in certain communities, but trying to use glass, stainless steel, or ceramic products to store your food. Overall, as I mentioned in the beginning, single-use plastics are a really big exposure and part of the biggest production part of plastic waste. So trying to avoid your single-use plastics and soft plastics. So when you go to the grocery store, bringing your tote bag instead of bringing a plastic grocery bag instead.
Yeah, it's a really good point about your single-use plastics, Sabina. We've been doing a lot of work, not only on microplastics, but we've developed an evidence to decision framework recently, which is basically how do you develop recommendations once you know something like a microplastic's harmful. And the first thing is applying what we call the essentiality criteria. And the states of Maine and Minnesota are using this at the moment for PFAS. So if it's not essential and this chemical is causing harm or this contaminant is causing harm, just ban it unless it's essential for society to function. So if we know microplastics are causing these health effects and single-use plastics don't have an essential function, so it's not something like a medical device that's critical for saving lives, ban them. And so we're really pushing this essentiality criteria for governments to start using this. I think also France might be doing something similar at the moment around PFAS. So anyway, really important thing for people to understand is that governments should be saying, if we see these early warning signs and it's not essential, we should be banning it. There's a question about funding to do a full review before. Yes, we want to continue to do an updated version of this, and we are chasing funding, Kimberly. So if anyone knows more funders, let us know. Just scan over this really quickly. The differentiation between nano and microplastics, it's a good question. I don't have the exact definition of a nanoplastic. It's like tiny, 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 tiny. Versus microplastics are a little bit larger. But I think we define it potentially in the paper. But there are obviously more concerns with nanoplastics because they're smaller and they can enter the body and get into even, they cross the blood-brain barrier even easier.
Thank you. I think we're almost at the hour now.
Yeah, there's so many questions. We can respond to these later. I don't know if that helps.
I can share these questions by email, and maybe you guys can answer by email. But we have a recording of all of them. So thank you all for sending in all these great questions. And I saw some asking about a recording of the webinar and the slides. So those will both be available on our website in the next day or so, and it'll also be sent to your emails. So thank you so much to our speakers for joining us today. This is such an important study, so we're really appreciative of your time today. And thanks everyone for tuning in, and we will see you next time.
Thanks so much, everyone. Thanks, Sarah.